Hi, everybody. My name is Ilya. I'm from TaxDome. And what we want to talk about here today is how to utilize TaxDome within your practice. And here with me to talk about this, I have Jessica Smith from Tax Savvy Jessica, and I have Brian from Brian Newman CPA. And we're super excited to have you guys here. And what we want to do is have essentially a little back and forth, because what actually happened was Brian and Jessica had linked together on an online forum. And they got in touch, and they, I believe, had a Zoom call where they went over some of their workflows, how they set up their practices. Brian found it extremely helpful in setting up his practice and kind of putting everything together while he uses TaxDome. So we wanted to get you guys together and really go through the thinking, your thinking beforehand, your thinking, what Jessica explained to you, and how you plan on running your practice afterwards. Brian, welcome. Thank you very much for being here. Jessica, the same. So Brian, if you could just give us a overview of how you connected with Jessica.
Sure. I'm a practicing CPA and have obviously been overwhelmed with all the changes. And, we find ourselves as solo practitioners in little Facebook groups that allows us to go back and forth and share the turmoil and what's impacting us. I had stumbled upon Jessica in one of these groups, and that's kind of where I found out about TaxDome, in terms of folks were beginning to speak positively of this, or they're looking for a portal or whatever it was. And as I had located it, Jessica had spoke very positively about TaxDome, and that had gotten me to kind of look into the program myself. So I started looking into it in December of 2020.
So you signed up, you felt that this was something that'd be interesting for your practice, but once you started setting it up, but it sounds like you had a little bit of difficulty when you were first setting it up. Is that correct?
I wouldn't say difficulty, I would say overwhelmed. There's so much to it. From being a practitioner standpoint, workflow has never really been something I've had to worry about or think about. I've always had a smaller practice where I kind of was able to manage everything on my own, but as time has gone on, things have kind of gotten busier and busier and busier. The idea of a workflow or something to centralize all the information was seemingly beneficial. When it came time to setting up the workflow or how this should go, that's where the overwhelmed aspect came from, in terms of how do I start this? How do I go about it? Obviously, lots of training available. That it was all beneficial, but it's still connecting the dots. And okay, I can upload clients, I can do this, I can do that, but where do I start with the workflow, and how do I make this work, and how do I make that work? Having somebody that was ready, willing, and able to kind of say, here's what I have, seeing all that from start to finish, point A to, like, so let's say point Z, seeing all those dots connected made it come full circle for me. And that was the benefit of sitting down with Jessica, because I spent probably a half hour talking about this to my wife, and she kind of lit up as well. And she's like, I'm excited for you, not really knowing why she should be excited.
Got it. That's awesome. Jessica, it sounds like you kind of had the secret touch, so to speak, in terms of putting together the capabilities that Brian was looking to set up, along with a practitioner standpoint of how to actually implement this. So if you could just talk a little bit about what your experience is with workflow, what makes it easy for you to set up versus someone else, and talk a little bit about your experience there.
Yeah, I actually stumbled across TaxDome when I was looking for an alternative to my prior provider, and TaxDome seemed to check all the boxes for me. In kind of getting involved with the community and getting feedback from other people, I said, this is the system I want to use. Everyone had commented a lot on all the changes that were being made. And I said, ooh, these changes are really intriguing. These would really benefit me. I had tried to set up my old system with my other provider, and I had gone through a lot of processes to get it all done. Then things changed, and they were going to not offer those features any longer. So TaxDome has those features that were going to be taken away. So I really got into it. I set everything up very blanketly. I went through all the firm settings. I started to work a little bit on the templates. The pipelines were a little bit confusing for me at first, but once I really got into writing everything down and breaking down my process for how I want to start this from beginning to end, and realizing that it makes more sense for me to start maybe by preparing my templates and my messages, and then deciding what the breadcrumbs were to get my pipelines laid out, and then starting to put all those pieces together, it was a lot easier than I had initially thought. And one thing that I decided to do when developing my pipelines is I look at it as a pipeline, as an action that has been completed. So every file that is in that particular part or every job in the pipeline, that file is there because the action or that header for that pipeline has already occurred. So I know where all of my files are throughout the entire process. And with the auto move job function, that has been extremely helpful because now I have tasks assigned that will move that to that completed action. So it's been very beneficial knowing, writing out my process from beginning to end, and knowing that I needed to start probably first with all of my templates and then start to work through the workflow, test it, retweak it, test it again until I kind of got it to the point where I'm at now, where I'm really happy with how things are moving.
Let's take a step back because I think we're using a lot of terms that we know, right? We're all know pipelines, we know jobs, we know what all this is, but you could explain to a fellow practitioner, what is workflow? All these templates, what's the point of setting this up? What are you getting out of this? And how is this better? And Brian, you mentioned earlier that you felt you reached the point where your business was happily growing to a point where you could take advantage of some of this stuff. So, but Jessica, can you just walk a little bit what you mean by that? What are those things that you were setting up?
Definitely. So a workflow is literally every single step that you take from the time that a client becomes a lead or is onboarded into your practice through the entire tax prep service that you offer, all the way through that last touch point with your client to offboard them. So for me, writing out every single bit of that for different scenarios. Obviously, I might have a workflow that is unique to people who are Schedule C filers versus individual filers. I might have a workflow that is unique for clients that I do representation work for versus my tax prep clients. I had to really sit there and kind of start really broad picture and just dump every task that I do into, and I just did it in an Excel spreadsheet, and then organize it in a manner that made sense, that I have to do this before I do this before I do that. And actually what helped me is doing it from the very end result and working my way backwards. So I reverse engineered my workflows. I knew that if I was going to prepare a workflow where the end result was that I sent a thank you to a client and they got their final tax documents, what did I have to do before that occurred in order for me to do that? And so I started truly from the end and worked myself backwards. And then as I had that kind of workflow, or what I sometimes call breadcrumbs, kind of figured out, then I was able to add maybe other little things that might take place, those one-off scenarios that don't always fall into that like perfect linear workflow. There are things obviously in tax prep that we find don't always happen in the way we intend. So I needed my workflow to be flexible. So I added other steps that I could move those jobs, which are essentially a client file, so an active return, to a different place in my workflow, which really benefited me to be able to handle all those unique situations that I might run into.
Essentially, this allows you to really set up the process that, as you mentioned, each return goes through. And we mentioned returns, but you do this for other things, right? For representation, whether you're doing bookkeeping or payroll, or Brian, do you do anything else besides tax prep, or are you mostly focused
Simply
on
tax prep? Yeah,
simply tax prep. But it's fully customizable to whichever process that you use. And so, Jessica, once you set this up, and when you explained this to Brian, was there, which part of that, what she said, made sense to you and kind of made it click that didn't make sense before?
Seeing the finished product, and it was listening to her walk through her workflow. And in the back of my mind, I knew the process. Every tax return is unique. And one thing that Jessica had mentioned to me previously was that I thought of every situation over the past 12 months where I said, aha, I've got to figure something out. And that was then built backwards, just to fill in the blanks of where that story came from. And the benefits of seeing everything was that I was watching somebody who had previously done what I wanted to do, except I didn't even know where to start. I knew the process would need to be done, and on a very minute microcosm individual basis, I can get things done. But once you go to scale this to going from one client to 100 clients, that's a little bit of a bigger task. And understanding automation, understanding how some of the stuff can be simplified, listening to somebody take me baby steps through this process, it made it all come full circle. And that's where really seeing the finished product was kind of the light bulb moment for myself that said, okay, now this is what I need to do. And I went ahead and I didn't copy verbatim what she did, but I created my workflow, and it took me about 4 hours. And now I've got a visual of all my jobs, and it's everything I want it to be.
That's awesome. Jessica, we've been talking about your end finished product. Do you mind sharing your screen a little bit, showing us what you showed Brian, and maybe if you could kind of quickly walk us through what you have set up and how you explained it to Brian, so that somebody that's watching this can really have that same kind of visual representation of what you built and why it's useful and how it works to save you time.
Definitely. So I will put on my screen here. I have a workflow right now. I'm still adding because I'm getting quite a bit of feedback from people for things that they want to see in their own workflow. So in my group, I've been asking people, what are some of your pain points? What are things that occurred in this last tax season that left you frustrated, left you feeling that you needed to overcome this in order to continue to move these files along? That was another way for me to look for things to implement into my workflow to overcome some of those things. So this is an example of a tax return prep returning client workflow, because my returning client workflow is going to be different from new clients, because new clients, there's a different onboarding process that I'm working on. But if I were to expand this, one of the things that I wanted to do differently is that I wanted to make sure that all of my clients received various correspondence from me, different touch points throughout the entire process. Because one thing I did notice is that there were some clients, now not all clients felt this way, but there were some clients who felt I should have been in contact with them more. They weren't sure where they were in the process. And so with TaxDome, I have been able to add those touch points as the file moves along. So here for this part of the workflow, the client is added, and all these things happen when the job would be the 2020 tax return. All these things are added to the pipeline, and this first automation kicks in. So the client gets a tax season kickoff email. I can show you what that looks like. I'll show you guys in the templates. I have a tax season kickoff email, and it looks just like this. And I just let them know, hey, we are getting ready for tax season. I need you to get ready, please. Here's your reminder. I provide a tax documents checklist in several different points, which will later convert them to an organizer, but I give them a list so they can start putting their documents together. I provide them with information about the next steps, let them know some of the things that are changing. I explain that my office hours are here. Here's when you can reach me. This year, I implemented a deposit for my returning clients, letting them know that my security is really important and that I'm going to be moving to TaxDome. I'm introducing TaxDome to them, letting them know that they'll get an invitation. These touch points, either by means of an automatically generated email or an automatically generated message, now puts my clients in the know for where they are in the process. So this has been extremely beneficial for me. Once these items have been taken care of, so here I have a bill, I have a contract, this particular workflow will then auto move once all these things have been achieved. And that's what I really like about the auto move is you can choose which parts of your workflow you want to auto move and which ones you don't. It makes sense for me for a lot of these steps to auto move. However, when I get to this point where I have some here that are chosen not to auto move, this is where those flexibilities within my workflow needed to occur. So I needed to have different workflows that I could kick in where if I receive documents from a client and I review them and I realize documents are missing, I didn't want the workflow to bypass that, hey, I now have to follow up with the client to request additional documents. And so what TaxDome does in this scenario, I'm actually able to just move the file or the job between the pipelines, and those tasks that I had created regenerate. So then I'm reminding myself, request documents, documents are in, still missing, request documents, documents are in. So that kind of flexibility was really beneficial. But a lot of these messages are kind of auto-generated. After the client completes their invitation, they get a welcome email. So in my templates, I have a welcome email, and a lot of this is just reiterating all of those things I want my client to know. I try to funnel as much information in front of them so that they feel they have all the information they need to ensure, a smooth transition. I let them know, here are my office hours. I talk a little bit more about TaxDome, kind of explain to them why TaxDome is what I'm using, because it is confidential. We can email through there, we can use messages, but we want to use TaxDome as the platform because it is secure. I let them know that here are kind of the next steps that we have to take. Take a moment to get familiar with TaxDome. I actually provide them with links to the instructional videos, which I have down here. How to use TaxDome as a client. This is straight from TaxDome's YouTube. How to, set up the mobile app on your computer. I'm providing them all the information. They don't have to ask for any of this. My onboarding process, I provide my tax documents checklist, and I ask for them to give me access to certain things. So this all translates, this whole process pretty much is automated up until the point where the client sends me all of their documents. And when we get here, now we have an organizer is applied to the file and sent to the client. And then they get a message in their platform saying, hey, I've sent this to you, please do this. They get a task assigned to them, letting them know that please mark this off when everything has been provided. I let them know I'm going to review it. And then I get to those other actions in my workflow. Most of these have tasks that I have assigned to myself. Again, I'm a business of one. So what I do that I think might be a little bit different and might be more helpful to people when they're visualizing how their pipeline should be created, I made sure that if I want to move a file to the next spot in my pipeline, that the task that I mark off has to be in the action that takes place before. So for example, if I am here, I'm going to mark off, send the appointment to my client, and then that will auto move to this pipeline, which says appointment request has been sent. So the task was marked off in the prior pipeline, but that auto moves it to the pipeline that says we're waiting for the client to get back to us for the appointment. That really helped me visualize my auto moves as well. I want them to auto move based on some kind of action I took in the prior pipeline.
I think this is awesome, but just for someone that's watching this might not fully understand what we mean. So, and in TaxDome, you're able to set up tons of automations. And an automation can be something like send an email or send a message that Jessica was showing. An automation could be to send a contract, send an invoice, basically all of the things that you would do within the course of your work. Our goal is to automate that as much as possible. Now, what AutoMove does is it allows you to create dependency. For instance, if you want to send an invoice to the client and you want to send a contract to the client, and you do not want to start work until that's done, but as soon as they sign the contract and as soon as they pay the bill, you want to then move the job to the next stage, that can be done automatically on the back end. So instead of you having to track, okay, did the client sign the contract? Did they pay the bill? You never have to worry about that. As soon as they action those items, it'll automatically move over. The same way if you have a large team and you have an admin that's preparing, maybe doing the admin work on a return, as soon as they mark their task off as complete, the job can automatically be then kicked over to the prepare to actually prepare the return and so forth. It's really fully customizable and allows each person to just complete what they need to do, whether it's the client settling an invoice or signing a contract or a preparer on your team marking a task is done, but it'll automatically move the job down the assembly line, so to speak.
That's how I had it in my mind when putting all of this together. These workflows are my assembly lines, all the bits and pieces that have to go together to move it down the line. If you look at it from a perspective of how a car is made, you have to create the mold and put the frame together before you can put on the tires and the doors and all that other stuff. Practitioners, we know how to prepare returns, but this makes it very methodical and it makes it very clear the steps that need to be taken to move it along. And also I find that this minimizes your margin of error. When I first started and I had 30 clients, it didn't matter. I didn't have to have a process. I could go jump from here to here to here to here, but I was actually wasting a ton of time. Now my goal is to have these portions within my workflow move to a point where now I'm ready to touch the file and now I'm ready to actually work on it. Whereas before, it might have been me, oh shoot, did I send that email to that client asking them for their docs? Ooh, no, I didn't. I got to follow up with them. Oh, did that client sign their invoice? Let me first look to see if that invoice is paid before I respond to them and ask them, oh, hey, can you pay me type scenario. So this does eliminate a lot of all of those extra off the cuff kind of like touch points that you have to make with people, because it's going to automate a lot of that for you. So I was just saying, with my workflow, some of the things I am continuing to test, because with every workflow you do want to test to kind of see what it looks like from the client view, which I think is great. I'm now thinking of other finishing touches that my clients would probably really like. So now I have a client thank you message, and I am going to add a section in the workflow, maybe where if the client has a balance due, there's an extra step where I can say, okay, you have money owed. Here's the link. Please make sure you read your letter. Here's a link to all the different states that their payment platforms, so you can make a payment electronically. There's a lot of other little things that I can put in here that would add those finishing touches and overcome those pain points that I have with some of my clients who, oh, I didn't know I owed money, or I didn't know I had to make estimated payments, or I didn't realize I didn't pay your invoice. It takes a lot of that guesswork out of my workflow.
I think you hit something really important here, is the communication to the client. And we actually recently did an interview with a fairly large firm. They've got 13 people. And they mentioned that one of the biggest pain points that they found in general on accountants was that there's so many things. Like if you look at your process, you have like 13, 14 steps in your process here. Mm-hmm. And there's so much that goes on behind the scenes. But imagine if, the client is not aware of anything. The client just sends you information and the client's in the dark. This allows you to add customized touch points to the client at each step of the way without you actually having to do anything. This way, the client is in the know. You're not getting these emails of, hey, what's going on? Where are we in the process? And you're able to actually, and both you and Brian mentioned this, that obviously your firms have grown, but you're able to keep that personal touch even as you have a larger client base, because you don't, it's automated. That allows you to be able to take on more clients and do more jobs, but still keep that personal touch that got you to where you are in the first place.
And the feedback that I've received from people that, especially newer clients who have never worked with a practitioner before, who has this kind of a process, they're like, wow, the constant informing me of where things were moving along and where things were going made me feel really secure, because they were using me for the first time. I was a new practitioner. We obviously deal with very sensitive information. This was actually a representative client who was a little concerned, because she's like, oh, well, my daughter found your information off of the internet, off of Facebook. And I had to let her know, like, I'm a real person. Here's how we can do things. And she was blown away by my onboarding process. So the onboarding process and getting her into TaxDome and letting her know, like, please don't send me anything through email, nothing through text. Here's how we're going to communicate. Getting those messages that say, here's how you complete XYZ. She was very impressed, very happy, and she thought it looked great.
That's awesome. Brian's, when you saw this, I guess, is there a certain part of this that really made sense to you? What Jessica's showing you here, is there, because I'm kind of on the side here, but really love to hear from your standpoint of what part of this really clicked for you, and when you really saw how you can apply it to your own practice and your own methodologies.
What ended up happening was, I believe Jessica was testing the system, and she had a sample client. She said, here's what it can be done. And I started with nothing. And so she flipped her screen, showed her screen, and she walked me step by step by step and said, here's what the automation is, here's what AutoMoves is. All these terms and technology that I was just overwhelmed with, she had simplified and she had already mastered. So seeing the finished product and saying, aha, this is where this goes and this is where this goes, it got me to a point. And there's still many areas that I can improve upon and continue to add, but for the time being, I probably have 25% implemented of what Jessica has, and walking into tax season, I feel great. I'll learn more. I'll have more time to dedicate once tax season probably over with. Just seeing the finished product and having her explain to me from start to finish, point A to point Z, that made things for me click. And that's where I had that light bulb moment. I said, aha, I now see what I should be doing, as opposed to watching a webinar and just kind of going, well, here's this process, and not connecting those dots in real time. Seeing the before, which for me was a blank workflow, and then seeing the after, which was what Jessica had already mastered and put down on paper, that made me sit back and go, okay, this is how the approach I want to take things. I was able to visualize the process, which made it a lot easier for me to mentally see it, because I'm not wired that way. I don't have the ability to mentally project or see things. I'm just a nuts and bolts guy, and I'll do everything by hand and create all kinds of busy work, where for the most part, Jessica, if she was here sitting next to me, she'd slap me upside the head and be like, do it this way.
Yeah.
That's awesome. One thing that to really focus on here, not focus rather, but to comment on, is that this process is iterative, right? You mentioned you set it up, 25% of the way, and that you see all the further optimizations and all the further ways you can automate your process and really customize it to returning clients, new clients, kind of what Jessica's had, because your process is going to be different. Jessica's, maybe your method of communication is going to be different, but you're able to set it up to how you want. It'd be really interesting to see kind of how you set it up now versus the different changes that you make during tax season and maybe afterwards as you kind of fine tune your process. We'd love to come back to you in a couple months or after April, once things have died down, and really see how your process changed, what you've changed from now until then, the further changes you plan on making. So thank you guys. I think this is super helpful, super interesting for us to see as well. We host these webinars, but it's very different when you have practitioners speak to one another. We think that this is awesome. Again, Brian, thank you for posting about this in the group. That's how this all kind of put together. Was Brian?
Yes, thank you, Brian.
On our Facebook community. Yeah, Brian posted in the Facebook community. Jessica blew up basically essentially because of that, because there's so many people in Brian's shoes. They know they want to install a process. They see it, but they're not really sure how to get from the idea to actually implementing it. It's really great to see that you're able to connect, and now you're really set up for tax season to implement this within your practice. So thank you, Brian. Thank you, Jessica. And
Thank you
this
for
is
having
awesome.
me. Thank you.